One of the tasks a seller must complete in the lead up to the sale of their business is to tell their employees that the business has been sold. There may be employees who've been with the business since its inception, and it's likely that close relationships have been formed. That's particularly so if the owner has also been there since inception and who is the one who started the business, which is still sometimes the case. Regardless of the circumstances, there is no denying that telling employees that your time is up and a new employer will be taking over the reins is never easy. The question often asked is, when is the best time to tell your employees you've sold? The sale of a business results in all employees being terminated by the seller with effect from close of business on the day before the settlement date, which is also sometimes called the completion date. That is because they are terminated, and that is a terrible word in this context, but they are terminated as a result of the sale of the business. That is the reason their employment is ending, because the seller will no longer continue to be their employer. All employees must be given prior notice of termination, and depending on when that notice is given, they're either required to work out the notice period or be paid in lieu of notice. So the notice period required to be given to the employees is going to vary depending on the terms of their employment contracts, coupled with the terms of the Pharmacy Industry Award, and also, of course, when you're planning on telling them. So employers or sellers should review the existing employment contract for each employee to check if there is a required notice period or whether the notice periods prescribed by law are what applies. If the notice period ultimately given to the employee is less than the period of notice required, then they need to be paid in lieu of notice. So if an employee is entitled, for example, to 3 weeks notice, but they're only given 2 weeks notice, then you need to pay them out a week in lieu. So as notice periods vary between employees, it is common for some employees to be given more notice than what would otherwise be required. That is because it's almost impossible to stagger the issue of notices to different employees. So if someone's entitled to 4 weeks and someone's entitled to 2 weeks, typically the seller employer tells them at the same time, because once one employee knows, then usually the news is out. But sellers need to carefully consider when to give that notice of termination to their employees. So if sellers want the employees to work out their notice periods rather than paying them in lieu of notice, that might mean telling them before the contract is unconditional. And the risk of doing that is that either the contract may not be completed, so it might be terminated, or settlement could be delayed, which then goes on to cause some angst and uncertainty amongst the employees. Often when employees are notified of termination of their employment, they can become distressed, disengaged, and also look for alternative employment. That's particularly so if they have some nervousness about who is coming in, or they don't know them, or maybe it's a change of brand and people don't typically like change. So this can be disruptive to the seller and, of course, to the day-to-day operation of the business. To minimise the risk of employees reacting negatively to the news that the business is being sold, the seller can delay giving notice until there's greater certainty of settlement. So perhaps when it's unconditional, or when a settlement date's actually fixed and those conditions which are variable and can be moved depending on timings like landlord's consent until they're actually locked down. However, if there's not enough time then between giving the notice and the settlement date for the employees to work out the notice period, the employees will need to be paid in lieu of notice. If giving notice is left until too close to settlement, there is also a risk that the employees will find out about the sale from another person other than the seller, and that's never an ideal situation. We have had that happen where suppliers find out because they're being contacted regarding security interests being released, and then the rep goes into the store, says something to the staff, and then a problem is created. Or sometimes the landlord waltzes in, or the centre manager waltzes in and says something, and you never want your staff to find out from someone other than yourself as the seller. So in short, The answer to the question is not easy. Employers who are selling their business should calculate the notice periods required to be given to employees and then weigh up the benefit of having the employees work out the notice period against the risk of them becoming distressed or disengaged and the cost of making payment in lieu of notice, and also the risk of them finding out from someone else. Sellers should also consider whether the buyer wants to interview the employees prior to settlement, because if so, and particularly if there is a clause in the contract regarding interviews and when they are to occur, the employees should be fully aware of the sale before being asked to meet with their potential new employer. Sometimes buyers like to be introduced to staff at the same time as sellers are telling them that they're selling. So often there is a staff meeting called where the seller says they're selling and then introduces the buyer. I'm not a huge fan of that unless there is a good news story to tell along with it, because your staff don't have time to digest. I personally think it's better for the seller to call a staff meeting or similar, tell staff all at the same time, let them digest that and, go through the motions and emotions, and then following on from that, have another meeting where you introduce the buyer or tell your staff a date on which interviews will commence. So, as I said, it's not easy when to tell your staff you've sold. There is a lot to weigh up, but there is support around you, and certainly it's best to be properly advised. In a later episode of this podcast, I will go into more detail about the selling process and how your staff fit in, as well as your responsibilities as a seller during that time. I look forward to bringing that episode with you in due course and hope you also found today of interest.